Welcome back to Free Space News, and this week I want to get into a really interesting story that's really been developing over the past month, and that has to do with the situation in Venezuela. So I want to start by giving you just a little bit of background on Venezuela if you're not familiar with it, because this is the first time I've actually covered Venezuela on my channel. So the Encyclopedia Britannica's page on Nicolas Maduro, I think, does a really good job of explaining what exactly has gone on in Venezuela really since the most recent election back in 2018 and leading up to today. Anyway, the Encyclopedia Britannica article says the following. On January 10, 2019, Maduro was sworn in for his second term as president. Earlier in the month, the opposition appeared to find a new life with the election of largely unknown 35-year-old Juan Guaido, a hardline opponent of the Maduro regime, and the head of the National Assembly. Guaido called on the Venezuelans to take to the streets in protest on January 23rd, and on that day in Caracas, he declared himself the country's acting president, claiming that the Constitution empowered him to do so because Maduro had not been elected legally and therefore Venezuela was without a president. In the short order, the United States, the United Kingdom, Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Chile, and Colombia, Costa Rica, Paraguay, Peru, Ecuador, Guatemala, and the Organization of American States officially recognized Guaido as the leader of Venezuela. An outraged Maduro declared himself the only president of Venezuela, branded Guaido's action as a conspiratorial coup engineered by the United States, and gave U.S. diplomats 72 hours to leave the country. Maduro received strong statements of support from Bolivia, Cuba, Mexico, Turkey, and Russia, the last of which has ties to the Venezuelan military and the oil industry, characterized Guaido's actions as an attempt to usurp power. So that's really the situation that's been developing within the past month or so. First of all, Guaido and many Venezuelan citizens are correct in their assessment that Maduro's election was likely illegitimate, given that he won about 67% of the vote, which is pretty unheard of in most democracies, and a lot of their issues with that election was well documented by the Western media. Now, the reason I'm covering this story now as opposed to a month ago is I was waiting for the situation to develop a little bit more in terms of international relations being broken off and just general escalation of this story. And recently we got just that. So according to a recent article from Reuters, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro said on Saturday his government had broken relations with Colombia and would expel some Colombian diplomatic staff after Colombia assisted the opposition's efforts to bring humanitarian aid into the country. He said the ambassador and consular staff would have to leave Venezuela within 24 hours. Now, the aid that he's referring to here is something that actually is very likely trying to be orchestrated by the United States. Now, soon following this, other countries like Russia have also responded to the situation. According to the Daily Mail just a couple of days ago, Russia has accused the U.S. of using aid deliveries to Venezuela as a ploy to carry out military action against President Nicolas Maduro's government. On Thursday, Guaido set out in a convoy to collect U.S.-supplied food and medicine stockpiled in Colombia, vowing to bring in the aid by Saturday. So clearly Nicolas Maduro doesn't want this aid to get into Venezuela, likely because A, he's a horrible person, and B, the only reason that he thinks the US and Western countries, or even adversaries for Venezuela like Colombia, are helping bring this aid is because they want to eventually oust him. Now, this accusation from Russia, I would take it with a grain of salt, given that generally the Russian government isn't the best place to get your news. However, don't doubt it either. It's completely plausible that the United States would want to support a coup against Nicolas Maduro's government, given the history that the United States has of supporting coups all over the world, especially in Latin America. Now, to give you an idea of how much Venezuelans actually need this aid, we can turn to yet another article from Reuters. This was published back in 2017, and they say that, quote, Venezuelans reported losing on average 11 kilograms or 24 pounds in body weight last year, and almost 90% now live in poverty, according to a new university study on the impact of the devastating economic crisis and food shortages. Now, Venezuela has been a country that is rich with corruption. Nicolas Maduro and Hugo Chavez before him came to power by essentially promising, socialist policies that are very popular within the country, but there have been a lot of problems with that. First of all, political corruption has led to resources not actually benefiting the citizens, but actually benefiting the elites in Venezuela. And in addition, the way that they tried to pay for a lot of these programs is by messing with their currency, and that ended up causing hyperinflation, which is a huge reason why there's a food shortage in Venezuela today, and people can't really afford the basic necessities. So my take on this story is pretty complicated. For me, this is tricky because I firmly believe that Nicolas Maduro is a horrible dictator who has brutally enacted policies that are not in the interest of his own people. He's incredibly corrupt, and he has to go. I would be very happy if he were to, not be in power anymore. However, the way that he will be discharged from power is crucial, and I don't support the US going in and doing regime change against Maduro. Now, this is mainly because regime change, the United States-led regime change throughout the world has never really worked. You take a really recent example like the Iraq War, where the United States went in and ousted Saddam Hussein, who again was a brutal dictator that had not only enacted policies that were not in the interest of his people, he'd actually gassed his own people and brutally murdered them. However, the result of getting rid of him was creating a power vacuum in the region, which ended up being filled by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda affiliates like al-Nusra. Also, I was reading an article from the Boston Review, which does a really good job of giving examples of regime change that the US has supported in the past. And a really interesting example from the same region as Venezuela is Guatemala. So the article says, quote, "Finally, regime change can contribute to the outbreak of entirely new civil wars by reversing popular policies or instituting unpopular ones. In Guatemala, US-supported leaders rolled back on signal achievement of the disposed Abren's administration. Land reform that had redistributed property from large landholders, such as United Fruit, to peasants. President, I'm going to completely mispronounce this, but Ydigoras Fuentes, also alienated many of the Guatemalan officer corps by allowing the CIA to train Cuban exiles on the Guatemalan territory for the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. These resentments contributed to the MR-13 rebellion that erupted in November 1960. Civil war continued in Guatemala in one form or another for more than 30 years, killing approximately 200,000 people. Evidently, the United States had not learned from prior experience, ousting interim Dominican President Francisco Enriquez y Carvajal in 1916, which sparked an insurgency that continued until 1922. One of the major factors that drove rebellion was land redistribution, which favored U.S. multinational corporations involved in sugar production and deprived many Dominicans in the region of their property. So one of the things that's really interesting about this example is that the United States had actual interests in Guatemala, particularly in fruit and sugar production. And the coup allowed the United States corporations to go into Guatemala and more easily have access to those resources. Interestingly enough, Venezuela is also a very resource-rich country with the second largest oil reserves in the world.
The government killed the country's main industry, and now we don't have the revenue to reactivate the oil industry.
So if the United States enacted a coup, it's very likely that whoever took power, regardless of whether it was Guaido or not, would be friendly to US corporations who would go in and exploit those oil reserves, which likely would not benefit the Venezuelan people, which could lead to some sort of conflict. What I'm trying to say here is, this situation really has no perfect solution. I honestly don't know what to do about this because Maduro clearly has to go, but I would argue that a coup is clearly not the way to do it. So I clearly don't know what should be done about this situation, but hopefully our dear leader Donald Trump has a plan.
We will have so much winning if I get elected that you may get bored with winning.
So that's going to do it for today's video. As always, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.